In the spring of 1943, the Allied war effort in Asia faced a crisis that threatened to collapse the entire theater. China, America's crucial ally against Japan, was on the verge of collapse. The Burma Road, the only land supply route connecting India to China, had been severed by Japanese forces. Without supplies, ammunition, fuel, and food, the Chinese armies would crumble, and Japan would consolidate its grip on the entire Asian continent. The stakes could not have been higher. But there was one option left, an option so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that many military leaders dismissed it as pure fantasy. That option was to fly over the Himalayas. The route became known simply as the Hump, and it was the most dangerous air route in the world. Pilots would have to navigate their heavily loaded cargo planes over mountain peaks that soared higher than 20,000 feet, through weather systems so violent they could tear aircraft apart in regions where navigation was nearly impossible and where a forced landing meant certain end in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The margin for error was non-existent. The casualties were staggering. In the first months of operation, planes were going down at an alarming rate. Some weeks, the Air Transport Command was losing more aircraft than were successfully making the crossing. Crews began calling it the Aluminum Trail because the wreckage of crashed planes marked the route across the mountains like a macabre navigation aid. Morale plummeted. Experienced pilots began refusing assignments. The operation was bleeding men and machines, and for what? The tonnage being delivered to China was laughably small compared to what was needed. For every 10 tons of fuel that took off from India, barely 6 tons arrived in China. The rest was consumed by the aircraft themselves, just making the journey. It was, by any rational calculation, an unsustainable operation. Military planners in Washington began to seriously question whether the Hump should be shut down entirely. Perhaps, they reasoned, those aircraft and crews could be better utilized in other theaters where conditions weren't quite so impossible. But shutting down the Hump meant abandoning China, and abandoning China meant giving Japan a free hand in Asia. There had to be another way. There had to be someone who could make this impossible operation work. That someone arrived in India in August of 1944. Colonel William H. Tunner was a methodical, detail-oriented officer who had built his reputation not through dramatic battlefield heroics, but through the decidedly unglamorous work of military logistics. While other officers dreamed of leading bomber formations or commanding infantry divisions, Tunner had spent years studying the science of moving cargo efficiently. His previous assignment had been running the Air Transport Command's ferrying division, where he had developed revolutionary methods for delivering aircraft from factories to war zones. He had turned what was once a chaotic ad hoc system into a precision operation. When he was offered command of the India-China wing of the Air Transport Command, he accepted immediately. He knew the reputation of the Hump. He had studied the casualty reports and the dismal tonnage figures, and he was convinced he could fix it. Tunner arrived to find an operation that, in his view, was being run more like a barnstorming air show than a military logistics operation. Pilots operated on their own schedules, taking off when they felt ready, flying their own preferred routes, landing when they arrived. There was minimal coordination, no standardized procedures, and virtually no systematic approach to maintenance, loading, or flight planning. Each crew operated as an independent unit, which might have worked for fighter pilots, but was disastrous for cargo operations. Tunner saw immediately that the Hump wasn't failing because the task was impossible. It was failing because it lacked system, discipline, and method. He began implementing changes immediately, and almost immediately he encountered resistance. The pilots, many of them experienced aviators who had been flying the Hump for months, resented this newcomer who had never flown the route telling them how to do their jobs. Tunner's first major directive seemed particularly absurd to them. He wanted to standardize everything. Same altitude for all flights, same routes, same speeds, same loading procedures, same timing intervals between takeoffs. The pilots complained that this approach was rigid and dangerous. The hump, they argued, required flexibility. Weather changed, minute by minute. Each flight was different. Standardization would lead to disaster. Tunner listened to their objections and then implemented his system anyway. He instituted what he called the block system. Aircraft would take off from Indian bases in precisely timed intervals, fly at assigned altitudes based on their direction of travel, and land in China in a coordinated stream. No deviation, no improvisation. If weather forced a pilot to turn back, he would turn back. There would be no attempting alternative routes or altitudes. The system depended on every aircraft doing exactly what it was supposed to do, when it was supposed to do it. To the veteran hump pilots, this seemed insane. They were being told to fly like machines with no room for pilot judgment or expertise. The complaints reached higher command almost immediately. Senior officers began receiving reports that Tunner's methods were actually making the hump more dangerous. His obsession with standardization, they were told, was inflexible and would lead to catastrophe when the inevitable emergencies occurred. Some pilots requested transfers. Others wrote letters to friends in the Pentagon suggesting that Tunner was in over his head. He had never actually flown the hump himself, they pointed out. How could he possibly understand what it took to survive those mountains? Tunner's response was to fly the hump himself, not once but repeatedly. He flew as co-pilot, as observer, and eventually as pilot in command. He experienced firsthand the violent turbulence, the icing conditions, the vertigo-inducing clouds, and the heart-stopping moments when mountains suddenly appeared through breaks in the weather. And every flight reinforced his conviction that standardization was the answer. The very unpredictability of the hump, he realized, was why system was so crucial. Pilots couldn't control the weather. They couldn't control the mountains, but they could control their procedures, and in that control lay safety. But knowing he was right and proving it to skeptical superiors were two different things. Tunner needed results, and he needed them quickly. He attacked every aspect of the operation with the same methodical intensity. He studied the maintenance schedules and realized that aircraft were spending far too much time on the ground. Mechanics were working without clear priorities, fixing whatever seemed to need fixing whenever they got around to it. Tunner implemented a system where every aircraft had a scheduled maintenance window, and mechanics worked in specialized teams, each focused on specific systems. A plane that landed in the morning would be inspected, serviced, loaded, and ready to fly again by afternoon. Time on the ground was time wasted. He revolutionized the loading process. Previously, cargo had been loaded haphazardly, with crews essentially making educated guesses about weight distribution. Tunner introduced loading charts, standardized cargo configurations, and trained loading teams who could prepare an aircraft in a fraction of the previous time. Every pound mattered. Every minute mattered. He calculated that if he could get each aircraft to make just one additional round trip per week, the total tonnage increase would be enormous. But it all depended on efficiency, and efficiency depended on system. Perhaps his most controversial innovation was what other officers began calling his weather obsession. Tunner established a comprehensive weather reporting network, with stations positioned along the route, and meteorologists assigned to analyze conditions hour by hour. He then made a decision that seemed to border on madness. He would fly in bad weather. Not just fly through it occasionally when necessary, but actually schedule flights during conditions that other commanders would have canceled operations for. His reasoning was precise. If you only flew in perfect weather, you would never fly enough to meet tonnage requirements. The weather over the hump was almost never perfect. Therefore, you had to develop procedures that allowed safe flight in imperfect conditions. His standardized routes and altitudes meant that even in poor visibility, pilots knew exactly where other aircraft would be. His improved navigation aids and procedures meant pilots could fly instruments with confidence. Weather was a challenge to be managed, not a reason to give up. Other officers thought he was going to get people needlessly ended. They filed formal complaints. Tunner, they argued, was so focused on tonnage numbers that he was sacrificing safety. His rigid adherence to schedule and procedure was creating dangerous situations. He was pushing aircraft and crews beyond reasonable limits. Some characterized his approach as reckless and wasteful of both machines and men. These complaints reached Washington, and they reached the ears of senior commanders who were already skeptical of the hump operation. Here was apparent confirmation that the operation was being mismanaged. Something had to be done. In the meantime, something remarkable was happening. Tunner's systems were beginning to work. The tonnage numbers started to climb. In the months before Tunner's arrival, the hump operation had been delivering around 3,000 tons per month to China. 3 months after Tunner implemented his systems, that number had doubled. 6 months later, it had tripled. Aircraft that had been making 1 or 2 trips per week were now making 5 or 6. The loss rate, instead of increasing as critics predicted, actually began to fall. Pilots flying standardized routes at standardized altitudes with standardized procedures were having fewer accidents, not more. The system was creating safety through predictability, but the complaints continued. Some senior officers, particularly those who had never been involved in cargo operations, simply could not accept that such a rigid, mechanical approach could be superior to the traditional model of experienced pilots using their judgment. They looked at Tunner's methods and saw bureaucracy stifling initiative. They heard reports of pilots being disciplined for deviating from procedures, even when those deviations seemed reasonable, and they saw inflexibility. The phrase wasteful standardization began appearing in reports. Critics pointed out that Tunner was burning fuel and engine hours at unprecedented rates. His insistence on maintaining flight schedules regardless of weather meant aircraft were being exposed to harsh conditions more frequently. His rotation of crews meant that some pilots were flying more hours than they had previously. All of this, critics argued, was wearing out machines and men unnecessarily. There was also a cultural dimension to the resistance. The Army Air Forces in World War II had a strong fighter-pilot culture. The heroes were the aces, the men who shot down enemy planes in dramatic dogfights. Transport pilots, cargo haulers, were looked down upon as second-class aviators, and here was Tunner, a career transport officer, dictating procedures to combat-experienced pilots and treating flying like an assembly line job. It rankled. Some senior officers, themselves former fighter pilots, instinctively sided with the complainants. Transport operations, they believed, shouldn't be this complicated. Good pilots should be able to fly cargo without all this system and procedure. The situation came to a head in early 1945. A series of incidents, each relatively minor on its own, combined to create what appeared to be evidence of systemic problems in Tunner's command. An aircraft crashed while attempting to land in weather that critics said should have grounded all flights. 2 pilots were involved in a confrontation with maintenance officers over whether their aircraft was safe to fly, with the pilots arguing that Tunner's schedule pressure was compromising safety. A report reached Washington suggesting that crew fatigue was becoming dangerously high under Tunner's operational tempo. None of these incidents would have normally resulted in command changes, but in the broader context of ongoing complaints about Tunner's methods, they took on greater significance. The decision was made at the highest levels. Tunner would be reassigned. The official reason given was that his talents were needed elsewhere, that his expertise in transport operations was valuable, and he was being moved to a position where he could have broader impact. But everyone understood what was really happening. He was being removed from command of the hump. His methods, his systems, his inflexible procedures had created too much controversy. The operation needed leadership that would be more responsive to the concerns of the experienced pilots who were actually flying the missions. Someone who would allow more flexibility, more pilot discretion, less rigid adherence to procedure. Tunner was reassigned to a staff position in the continental United States. For an officer who had just revolutionized one of the most important supply operations in the war, it was effectively a demotion. He was being taken out of operational command and given a desk job. Some of his critics were satisfied. The cowboy cargo pilots had prevailed over the accountant colonel. The hump would be flown the way it should be flown, by experienced aviators using their judgment and skill, not by following some rigid system that treated them like robots. And then something interesting happened. Without Tunner's systems, the hump began to deteriorate. The new commander, responding to pilot preferences, relaxed many of Tunner's procedures. Pilots were given more discretion over routes and altitudes. The rigid scheduling was eased. Maintenance procedures were made more flexible, and tonnage began to drop, not dramatically at first, but steadily. Aircraft that had been making 5 trips per week under Tunner began making 3 or 4. Maintenance backlogs began to develop. The accident rate began to climb. Within 3 months, the hump operation was delivering less tonnage than it had been under Tunner and doing it less safely. The data was undeniable. Tunner's methods, his supposedly wasteful and inflexible procedures, had actually been making the operation more efficient and safer. The pilots who had chafed under his systems discovered that without them, the operation became more chaotic and dangerous. The standardized routes that had seemed so restrictive had actually been preventing mid-air encounters. The rigid maintenance schedules had been keeping aircraft in better condition. The weather flying procedures had been reducing accidents, not increasing them. Everything that had seemed wrong about Tunner's approach turned out to be right. Washington noticed. More importantly, General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, noticed. Arnold was a visionary who understood that air power was going to be crucial not just in World War II, but in all future conflicts. And he recognized that logistics, the unglamorous work of moving supplies and equipment, was the foundation of air power. Arnold had been skeptical of some of Tunner's methods, but he couldn't argue with results. And now, watching the hump operation decline without Tunner, he realized something important. Modern air warfare required modern logistics, and modern logistics required exactly the kind of systematic approach that Tunner had pioneered. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe was reaching its conclusion, Arnold made a decision. The Army Air Forces needed to rethink its entire approach to cargo operations. And the man to lead that transformation was William Tunner. But Arnold didn't just want to vindicate Tunner or prove his critics wrong. He wanted to apply Tunner's methods on a scale that would prove, once and for all, whether this systematic approach to air logistics was truly the future or just an interesting experiment that had worked in one limited situation. Arnold created a new command, the Air Transport Command, Ferrying Division, and gave Tunner command with broad authority to implement his systems across all Army Air Force's cargo operations. It was more than a reversal of his quasi-demotion. It was a promotion and an endorsement. Tunner was being told to take everything he had learned on the hump and apply it to the entire air transport network. If it worked, it would revolutionize military logistics. If it failed, it would vindicate all the critics who had said his methods were too rigid, too mechanical, too divorced from the realities of aviation. Tunner approached this new command with the same methodical intensity he had brought to the hump. He standardized procedures across all routes. He implemented systematic maintenance programs. He created training programs that taught pilots not just how to fly, but how to be part of a coordinated logistics system. He pushed for technological improvements, better navigation aids, better weather forecasting, better loading equipment. And he gathered data, mountains of data, proving mathematically that his methods reduced accidents, increased efficiency, and saved lives. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945, before Tunner's new systems could be fully implemented across the entire air transport network. But the data from the operations where his methods had been applied was compelling. In every metric that mattered, efficiency, safety, tonnage delivered, Tunner's systematic approach outperformed the traditional model. Some officers still grumbled. The old fighter-pilot culture still looked down on cargo hauling as unglamorous work. But the numbers didn't lie. Then came the Berlin airlift. In June 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all ground access to the city. 2 million civilians were trapped, with only enough food and fuel for a few weeks. The only way to supply the city was by air. It was the hump all over again, but worse. The hump had been about supplying an army. Berlin was about supplying an entire city. The tonnage requirements were staggering. Experts calculated that it would require delivering thousands of tons per day, every day, indefinitely. Most military planners thought it was impossible. There was simply no way to sustain that level of air operations. Tunner, by now a general, was given command of the Berlin airlift operation, and he approached it exactly as he had approached the hump. He implemented the same systematic procedures, the same standardized routes and altitudes, the same rigid scheduling, the same maintenance systems. And he faced the same resistance. Pilots complained about the inflexibility. Some officers argued that the system was too mechanical, that it didn't account for human factors. Critics said Tunner was running the operation like a factory assembly line, that he had turned pilots into bus drivers. Tunner didn't argue. He let the results speak for themselves. The Berlin airlift began delivering tonnage at rates that stunned observers. Aircraft were landing in Berlin every few minutes like a conveyor belt in the sky. The system that had seemed so rigid and mechanical on the hump proved even more effective when applied to the Berlin operation. In the peak of the airlift, Tunner's command was delivering over 10,000 tons per day to Berlin. The operation that experts had said was impossible was not only possible, it was being executed with a level of efficiency and safety that seemed almost supernatural. The Berlin airlift lasted 11 months. In that time, Tunner's command delivered over 2 million tons of supplies to Berlin. The loss rate was astonishingly low. The efficiency was unprecedented, and, perhaps most importantly, the operation achieved its strategic objective. The Soviet blockade failed. Berlin remained free. And the Western Alliance demonstrated that it could sustain complex operations through sheer logistical excellence. Tunner's methods were no longer controversial. They were doctrine. The same systematic approach that had gotten him effectively demoted from the Hump Command was now being taught at every Air Force logistics school in the world. The rigid procedures that pilots had complained about were now standard operating procedure for cargo operations. The mechanical assembly line approach that critics had mocked was now recognized as the foundation of modern military airlift capability. But the story of Tunner's quasi-demotion and vindication reveals something deeper about military innovation and institutional resistance to change. Tunner's methods worked because they were based on data, analysis, and systematic thinking, rather than tradition and instinct. But military organizations, like all human institutions, tend to resist change, especially when that change comes from someone outside the established hierarchy of prestige. Transport pilots were not supposed to be the innovators. The heroes were the fighter aces, the bomber commanders, the men who faced the enemy directly. Tunner was doing something much less glamorous. He was making logistics work. The resistance to Tunner's methods wasn't really about whether standardization was good or bad. It was about culture, about who had the right to define how things should be done, about whether flying should be treated as a craft requiring individual skill and judgment or as a system requiring discipline and procedure. Tunner's genius was recognizing that it could be both. His systems didn't eliminate the need for skilled pilots. They created an environment where skilled pilots could operate more safely and effectively. The officers who pushed for his removal from the Hump Command weren't villains. They were genuinely concerned about safety and efficiency. They looked at Tunner's rigid procedures and saw danger. They heard pilots complaining about inflexibility and assumed that meant the system was flawed. They couldn't see what Tunner saw, that the apparent inflexibility was actually creating a more predictable, safer operational environment. They made a reasonable judgment based on incomplete information and institutional bias. They were wrong, but understandably wrong. What made Tunner different wasn't just that he was right. Lots of people are right. What made him remarkable was his absolute conviction that data and systematic analysis would ultimately prevail over instinct and tradition. He didn't need everyone to understand his methods. He needed them to work. And he was willing to be unpopular, to be criticized, even to be removed from command, because he knew that eventually the results would speak for themselves. The Berlin airlift made Tunner famous, but the Hump had already proved his methods. The difference was that by the time of Berlin, the institutional resistance had crumbled. The data from the Hump, from the period after Tunner's departure when tonnage declined, from the subsequent improvements when his methods were reintroduced, all of that data had convinced enough senior officers that Tunner's approach was valid. Berlin wasn't about proving the concept, it was about demonstrating scale. In the decades after World War II, as the United States Air Force developed into a global power projection force, Tunner's principles became foundational. Modern military logistics, the ability to deploy and sustain forces anywhere in the world, is built on the systematic approach that Tunner pioneered. The criticized procedures that seemed too rigid, too mechanical, too divorced from the romance of aviation turned out to be the key to making air power truly effective as a strategic instrument. Today, when massive cargo aircraft land every few minutes at military bases around the world, when complex supply chains stretch across continents and oceans, when tonnage is measured in millions rather than thousands, it all traces back to a stubborn colonel who believed that flying cargo required the same systematic discipline as manufacturing automobiles. The military officers who fly these missions probably don't think much about William Tunner. They follow procedures that have been refined over decades. But those procedures, the standardized routes, the rigid timing, the systematic maintenance, the detailed planning, all of it descends directly from the methods that Tunner developed while flying the Hump. The irony is that Tunner's quasi-demotion, his removal from command of the Hump, was probably the best thing that could have happened for his legacy. If he had remained in command throughout the war, his methods might have been seen as specific to that operation, an interesting innovation that worked in one particular situation. But by being removed, by having his systems partially dismantled, and then seeing them fail by being brought back and given an even larger command, the value of his approach was proved beyond doubt. The experiment had a control group. The data was undeniable. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Tunner's story. Innovation in large organizations requires not just good ideas, but proof that survives skepticism. Tunner's ideas seemed wrong to experienced, intelligent officers who had legitimate concerns. He couldn't simply assert that he was right. He had to prove it, and then prove it again, and then prove it on an even larger scale. The resistance he faced wasn't an obstacle to success. It was part of the process of validation. Ideas that can't survive institutional skepticism probably shouldn't be implemented at scale. But ideas that do survive that skepticism, that prove themselves despite resistance, those ideas change everything. Tunner's systematic approach to air logistics changed how militaries think about supply operations. It enabled the global power projection capability that defined the Cold War and continues to define modern military operations. It saved countless lives by making dangerous operations safer. And it all started with a stubborn colonel who refused to accept that impossible operations were actually impossible, who believed that any problem could be solved with enough systematic analysis and disciplined execution. The general, who was effectively demoted for being too rigid, too systematic, too obsessed with procedures and data, turned out to be one of the most important military innovators of the 20th century. His methods, once controversial, are now taken for granted. The airlift capability that he pioneered is now considered a fundamental element of military power. And the lesson of his story, that systematic thinking can solve problems that seem impossible, that discipline and procedure can be more effective than individual heroism, that data can overcome institutional bias. Those lessons remain relevant today. William Tunner never commanded troops in battle. He never shot down an enemy plane. He never led a dramatic assault. He moved cargo. He developed procedures. He analyzed data. And in doing so, he changed warfare. The quasi-demotion that seemed like a rejection of his methods was actually just a pause before they were validated on the largest possible stage. Sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be removed from command, watch your methods be dismantled, see the predictable failure that results, and then be brought back to prove your point beyond any doubt. That's what happened to William Tunner, and that's why his story matters. Because it shows that institutional resistance to innovation isn't necessarily bad. It's a filter. Ideas that survive that filter, that prove themselves despite skepticism, those are the ideas that change the world. Tunner's airlift strategy survived. It proved itself, and in the process, it transformed military logistics forever. The stubborn general with the wasteful procedures turned out to be a genius after all, but he had to be demoted first to prove it.